Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining. It's January 16th, 2024. Almost said 2023. We're here to talk about WordPress 6.5, which we're about less than a month until beta 1 on February 13th. So this is an early look. There will be a plug to help test at the end of this. But this is an early look at some of what's in progress. Think of it as like an early product demo where we're trying to get feedback, trying to get folks excited, and to show what's to come. So without further ado, I'm just going to remind folks of the roadmap post, which you can see here. I will drop this in the link in the chat, and we're not going to go through everything on here. So part of what's we had to make the hard decision around is what's ready to test, and also there's just too much to go through. So we're going to try and go through as much of it as possible. Saxon is here as a designer to help do this, and Isabel is also very kindly going to go through some of the drag and drop stuff. But as a reminder, this is some of what we're looking at. We're not going to go through some of this stuff. One note I wanted to call out that I know folks were excited about, the navigation overlay being powered by template parts has been punted from 6.5. So I know some folks were excited about that to see a demo of it. There is still stuff that's demoable. I still encourage you to check that out and help test so we can get it into a future release. But for now, I'm going to pull up a couple different test sites and environments to go through some of the features. And I'll do a couple of demos first, and then I'll hand it off to Isabel to show some drag and drop, and we'll end on Saxon before opening up to Q&A. Does that sound good to folks? We can get a thumbs up. Dope. All right. So to kick us off, I'm going to dive into this InstaWP setup, which again, at the end, there'll be a plug for you all to help test this. So anyone can actually go through this. So what I'm going to demo here is some of the style revisions work that's been done. And this test site is actually was used for a previous product demo, I think for WordPress 6.3. And the reason I use this is because it shows off a lot of what it would look like if you have a site with a lot of changes to styles. There's also the option to test from a completely blank site, but I'm choosing intentionally to have this be more robust. So you'll see like there's 133 revisions just with the template. That is also new in 6.5 is template and template part revisions. Right now it's the old school interface, but it's nice to at least have this as an option so you can see all of those things. Let's see what happens if I go to editor, if it brings me back. This is part of what's fun about a demo. As part of this too, style revisions has gotten upgraded, and it's been upgraded in a few ways. So part of it is originally when there were style variations, there wasn't really a description of the changes that happened. So if you're clicking through the different revisions, it's hard to get a sense of what actually has been changed. And in this case, you'll see there are these little information blurbs about what's actually shifted with the option to apply. And then you can see like these styles are applied to your site. There's also pagination at the bottom. So you can actually switch through, which is part of why I wanted to demo this, is so you could get a sense of what it looks like on a site with a lot of robust changes. The other option that I think is really cool that I actually want to do a YouTube video on, this site actually currently has a bug that was just fixed by Raymond, but this padding along here is actually not supposed to be here. So this should be a bit more visible. You can actually turn on stylebook. And so when you're going through revisions, you can see how it might look across both just like a template, and you can toggle on and off the stylebook, which I think is going to be a huge game changer when going through revisions. I think right now, just having this one-dimensional look at it without the stylebook makes it hard to catch some things that might otherwise shift. So that is a look at what's to come with revisions. I am especially curious for feedback around how the system works with style revisions and with template and template parts. How do you know when to go into which one? And how we can kind of unify that, especially as we think about phase 3. So I'm just going to tuck that for you all to think about. Next up, we have sync pattern overrides. And I'm gonna play this video, but we can also kind of go into this as well. This just might be faster. I was worried I would get caught up in trying to set up a demo. So in this case, right now, currently, you can only set up overrides for paragraphs. And what that means is the long-term vision of this is that you have a sync pattern and you can have the layout be consistent, but the content can be different. So I think folks often use the analogy of like a Teams page where maybe you want to be able to update the team members or the contact information, but you want the overall layout to stay the same. So you want the content to be unique, but then you want the layout to be consistent. And this starts us down that path. Currently, the paragraph block is the only one the only block that allows overrides. So for this test, it's a mirror test, but it's to get a sense of the experience, both in terms of UX and just generally, does it hold up and work? A lot of thought has been put into this, and so let's jump into this video. And if at any point a feature I'm talking about doesn't make sense, please also raise your hand or something, interrupt me. I can explain more. I don't want to assume a bunch of knowledge, and I'm very deep in all this stuff. So in this case, you're adding a new pattern. You need it to be synced. So you'll see the typing out pattern with overrides. Add in a couple of blocks. So you'll see the way this is written out is kind of the difference between what is overridable and what isn't. In the future, they're working on image, heading, and button blocks, I'm pretty sure, next to have overrides in place. Let me move where you all are. So you'll scroll down, you'll see this pattern overrides, allow instant overrides. And then from there, if you go to add it in a new post, you'll see the option reflected. So this is a very simple example, but you can imagine in the future how this might work. So this can be edited. And you'll notice here that this is using the same sort of content editable experience that we have right now when you're creating a page in the site editor. So this is something else to think about, is that difference between editing global versus more local content and how we can continue to refine that. I'll keep playing. And you'll see this one, you cannot edit it. And you'll notice that it says edit original, and that's also part of what the new experience is. So these are all the same technical patterns in terms of the sync pattern, but they just have these overrides. So allowing you to you insert the pattern, have the same layout, but then edit the content based on what you've allowed. And that brings you back to editing the overall pattern. Very clever dev testing here. And then you can see after making a change to the original, it updates in these instances as well. I'm pretty excited about this one. I think it'll be a big game changer in the future with a lot of what we've heard from enterprise folks in particular. Next up, let me see what I was going to do next. Data views. Okay. A lot of things to test. So data views is part of the march towards a WordPress admin redesign, and it's starting in the site editor. It's starting in a very contained way. It also touches on workflows, as I will show you in a second. So we'll go to templates to keep moving. There we go. Manage templates. And right now, this is stable in the Gutenberg plugin. So if you install the Gutenberg plugin and activate this, oh, question. We'll get to the question at the end. This is great. Actually, yeah, drop your questions in the chat. We can move back on them. Right now, the only thing that's not available in Stabilize are these views, but otherwise you're able to see this new experience. And what this allows you to do is you'll see these different grid views, different layouts. And you can imagine this starts down the path of personalization and saving views to allow folks to use the same view you're using, or to have some sort of customized workflow, or maybe you only want to see things that apply to your job or what you're trying to do on the site itself. And then you also have filters. So in this case, we have templates that relate to 2024. I also create a custom template if I want to quickly find those. And again, you can change the view of these. You can also decide which fields you want to show, how many rows per page, sort by, all sorts of stuff. So this just allows for some new workflows and also honestly improves the view of this page and how it was before. There's also these additional filters that you can also set. Work is underway to allow for bulk editing, which I think if I go, no, not this one. Maybe it's table. Yeah, they're in Gutenberg Nightly. You'll see an option to bulk edit. So that's some of what's being worked on to allow you to actually do things like reset or delete custom templates quickly, which is often more useful for pages. This experience has also been added to patterns. So same sort of thing here. I won't go through this. It's basically the same kind of setup. But I do want to show pages. And pages and patterns are both experimental at this point. And what I like about this is you can set custom views here. And this is where we kind of touch on the workflow stuff that comes into phase 3. So let's imagine in the future, I have a custom view for all my editors who are going to review posts. You can basically set that up. So I can maybe say like editors and have a custom view from here that's, view options, sort by, let's actually do filter. Pending review or private or published. I can kind of set all these different things. So this is a quick look at that now. Data views is obviously touching on a huge amount of work and eventually will not just be contained to the site editor. And so part of why we're trying to get feedback within the site editor now and to experiment there is to figure out what can be brought out further. Fabian also brought up a great question on a GitHub issue about extensibility, and I do want to reassure people this is definitely being built with extensibility in mind, but they're just trying to lock down the APIs for now to create a solid experience before moving on to extensibility. All right, and last, font library. This one's fun. So the font library has been a feature that's been in progress for a while. I'm very excited about the possibility of this being added in. So if we open up styles, go to typography, curious how many people find this. That's one of the things I'm excited to hear feedback on. Manage fonts. In this case, I'm actually going to show this connect to Google Fonts, but you can also upload your own fonts. And some work was recently done to change where fonts are uploaded to, so you can have customizations there. But this allows for a great user experience where I can just browse through Google Fonts. Let's go with this one. I can select however many you like. Actually, when I was setting this up, I wanted to have a select all because this is really annoying to have to do. But I can select as many as I want, hit install, and you'll see up here a notification. They were installed. When I go to library, you'll now see this as an option, and they're immediately active. And so I can then go into headings and let's say, shift that over. Let's say I want it to be, this is what's always fun, is which options are available. That is the gist of how the font library works. As you can imagine, we need to figure out a great experience with revisions. There's use cases around user permissions, and currently the biggest effort undergoing right now at the font library is the REST API, redesigning the REST API. So any REST API maintainers on here, please help test. At this point, I'm going to pass it off to Isabel. And if you're open to sharing about drag and drop.
Yeah, sure. Can I share my screen?
Let's find out.
Let me see.
I might need to
Share
change
screen.
permission.
Oh yeah, you'll have to give me permission, yeah.
One moment. Okay, try now.
Okay. I think that is what I want to share. Ah, wait. It's disabled in system preferences. Sorry.
I can jump in if you want to set that up as well.
Okay, hang on. I think I'll just need to get back to the.
Love the cutout halfway through the sentence. Do you want me to jump in and demo a
Yeah,
few
let
things?
tell me to jump in just because it doesn't necessarily matter unless she comes back and it's like I have a meeting or something. But yeah, that'd be great if you don't mind.
Okay. All right, I will share my screen and hopefully it'll work. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
So I'll be demoing a few things today, some of which are in Figma, just because the branches are in a working state. But for all of this work, there is GitHub issues and pull requests, and it is all in motion. So feel free to check out GitHub and leave comments there and see the state that it's in, because it is evolving quite quickly. This, however, is an actual branch. The first thing I want to demo is the name has changed a lot. You could say it's section styling. So just to frame the problem a little bit. Generally, when building a website, you have pages that contain multiple sections, and those sections can vary in style. A very basic example being light and dark style variations. And the current way that Gutenberg is set up and the styling is set up to restyle a particular section on your page, you would have to, traditionally or right now, you would have to style things manually. So I'd have to go in and change the background color and the text color and links and buttons. And I'd have to do that for every single section, which is obviously not very efficient workflow, particularly if you have a pretty complicated site. So we're introducing this idea of section styles, which the way it's built right now, and this may change, is really just an extension of block style variations. So with buttons, for example, you can have multiple block style variations. And so we're extending that to containers as well, and also the ability for block style variations to be defined outside of the context of a single block type. So by that, I mean, you can create a block style variation that it can apply to a group block and columns block. And so that enables workflows like this, where if I have a pattern or a container like a group block, I can change the styling of this just very easily through a few options that a theme author can provide. And in future, we may allow the creation of these through the UI as well. So it's just a very quick way to create these reusable style types that can apply to many different blocks, and sections being the kind of the primary use case there. So you can imagine these section styles will be based off your palette. You might have a light version, like a standard version, and then a dark version. And it just allows for quite a fun experience as you're building out pages using patterns and changing styles. And if you're a theme author and you have a number of patterns, then you can create block style variations, and you're almost like multiplying the number of patterns you have available in a way, which is really cool. There is some work to be done around how nested blocks work in here, and we've come across some challenges there, which we can get into at the end of the conversation. If we have time, we can discuss a few of the issues there. But as I mentioned, this is actually a branch that's working, and so we are hopeful it'll get into 6.5, but it depends on whether we can overcome this technical challenge that we've faced. So that is just a caveat to this work. The second thing I want to demo is a common issue that we've come across. And this is Figma, but there is, again, there is a branch and there is an issue about this, and it's really just creating clear lines between your content and your template. So now that you can edit content within the site editor, which is great because you can see the surrounding context. It's a more accurate representation of what a user will see when they visit your site. You can see the header, the footer, you can see how the page is structured and laid out. But that does introduce some usability concerns, primarily that you can modify elements outside of a post or a page. So I could theoretically click on the template, switch to editing the template, and then make some changes, and I'm not aware that I'm making those changes, and so that it applies globally as opposed to just the page itself. This is a common problem that we've observed. And so we're trying to put in some better guardrails in place to prevent that from happening. There are two changes that we hope to be making in 6.5. One is just a better placeholder state for the post content block. So if you've ever modified a page in the site editor and you have your post content block, it's really just an empty paragraph. A prompt, which is fine for a writing experience. It's kind of what you want. It's a sort of distraction-free focus mode, but when you're editing a page and you're in a more sort of a design environment, you want to make sure that you're adding content within the content block and not outside it. So I won't show that here, but basically the placeholder state of the content block, we're kind of trying to make that a bit more prominent so that people are directed there instead of outside of that one singular paragraph block. And then the second change, which I'll demo here, is just highlighting editable blocks in a better way. So currently when you're editing a page, we don't actually highlight the blocks that are editable. So if you create a template and you add a post title block, for example, and a post content block, those two things you can then edit within a page because they're based on the page itself. But we don't actually highlight those in the site editor at the moment. So what we want to do is take an approach where when you're in the site editor and you're modifying a page, we want to highlight the blocks that are actually editable. So in this case, I have a post title block and a featured image. And in that way, we hope that this will lead to less confusion and just a high visibility around what actually is editable. This can also tie into something I'll be demoing next, which is the block connections work. And maybe I can touch on that when I walk through that. But the general idea is blocks are highlighted. I can click on them. And then another concept that we are exploring that may or may not make it in 6.5 is just better, some stronger shortcuts into editing your template when you're editing a page. So if you can see, there's a border around the frame here that's meant to represent the template itself. So if I click on anything outside of what's editable in the page, then it essentially selects the template. So this is kind of meant to offer a shortcut into editing the template, and then you can go back into editing the page again. But this is just an experiment. We've tested this on our branch, and I think it's a lower priority than highlighting editable blocks and a placeholder, better placeholders for the content block. This same pattern can also apply to the same design pattern can also apply to pattern overrides, which Anne just demoed. So if you think about pattern overrides or synced patterns, they're kind of similar in templates in a way, in that they're both global, and then you can override certain aspects of them. So a pattern, you can override, say, a paragraph, and a template, you can override like a post title block or the post contents. So we want to show you the same sort of experience when you're hovering over a synced pattern. If something is overridable in there, then we do the same thing where we highlight the blocks that are editable, and from there a user can go in and make changes. Anything that isn't highlighted is not editable, is not marked as editable. So it's a nice way to kind of link the two experiences. The last thing I want to demo is block connections. So there's a few reasons why this work is important. The first is just more technical. It's actually what synced patterns or the overrides make use of behind the scenes. And then the other aspect is more user-facing, and that is being able to connect certain blocks to custom fields within a post type. So this is a pretty standard workflow, but it's actually interesting when you think about the editor experience and full site editing. Let's assume in this case, I'm on a template and I have a post type here, and I select a paragraph block. I can then connect this paragraph block to a custom field. If I'm in the template, the content of the block, once connected, obviously it doesn't have any content to pull. So it follows a similar pattern to the post title block, where we just show the field that's being connected. And then for more complicated blocks that may have multiple attributes, so you can connect singular attributes within blocks, not just the block itself. So an example, in the case of an image, you may have like the source of the image and then alt text, and you can connect those to different fields in different ways. So this is just the first version of the experience. I think I expect in future it may be more contextual. So in the block editor, when you select an image, you can actually modify the alternative text in the inspector. And so there should be ways of connecting that to fields directly within the inspector versus having to do it through this interface. But this is just kind of a simpler V1. And then once you do have your connections, obviously when you switch back to editing the actual post or viewing the post on the front end, those fields are then connected and presented. And obviously something we were discussing, which will not be in 6.5, but it is interesting to think about, is whether these fields are then editable. So if I have a block like this paragraph block that's connected to a custom field and I modify the block, will that change the custom field behind the scenes? So you're essentially building up a user interface for modifying a post, which is kind of interesting to think about, particularly for things that aren't necessarily on the front end. So if you have feedback about that idea, GitHub is a good place to leave it. We can also discuss it here. But in saying that, it does introduce some usability concerns around if we do that, you need to make it very clear that when you modify a block, you are actually modifying the custom field behind the scenes. So it's one concern that we have. That's it. If, as I mentioned, all of these are in GitHub, and there are branches that you can play around with. They're in varying states. But there are some interesting discussions, both technically and user-facing, that would be good to get feedback on as we progress forward. Yep. Questions at the end, I suppose?
Yeah.
Cool.
We can keep it going, but I think some of your demo might encourage more questions. Isabel, are you game to try
Yeah,
to demo again? And thank you, Saxon.
it should work now, hopefully. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yep, cool. So I'm going to demo a few improvements to the drag and drop behavior. And the first thing I'm going to do, because you might not have everything that it currently does very present, is show this is just regular WordPress 6.4.2. So this is the state of things now, and then we're going to compare with the state of things in Gutenberg. Now, if I want to, so here we have a cover block. This is the top block with the cat, and then we have a group, and they have no space between them because we're just doing these sort of sections with different blocks of color here. And so if I'm trying to drag something, so first, if I'm trying to drag something into that cover block, just sort of under the content that's already there, it's pretty much impossible. I can drag it inside the row that's at the top, but if I want to drag it underneath, it doesn't happen. And then if I drop it here, it just sort of awkwardly goes between the group and the cover. So that doesn't work very well. And the other thing that doesn't work very well is for group. So here this sort of brownish and the green sections are both groups. And and they have no space between them. And if I want to drag something between the two, that also does not currently function. So these are things that we have been working on to improve. And another thing, yet another problem with our current drag and drop implementation is that, say I have, so this is a tagline block, and see how if I drag it over this buttons block, the drop indicator actually appears, telling me that I can drop it between the buttons, but then I can't. That's not a very great experience. So, so what we already have on Gutenberg trunk now is all of these issues fixed. Okay, so firstly, if I now want to drag something into my cover block, it actually happens. And then if I want to drag it and put it between the two group blocks, that is also now possible. And the other thing is that now if I'm trying to drag a block into somewhere that it can't actually go, then I see I have clear visual feedback that that's not possible to do. Cool. So these are the things that we have currently on Gutenberg trunk. I'm not sure if they're all already in a stable version of the plugin. I'm not 100% sure about that. I know they're in trunk. And then the next thing I want to show is a couple of pull requests that are still in progress. They're like highly likely to land soon. One of them is by Andy Sarong. It's a list view drag and drop improvement. And it makes the experience of dragging and dropping things inside the list view a bit more nice, I guess. So I'm going to show that. I'm on this page is on that plugin branch, and you can see that grabbing an item from the list view and trying to drag it, there's sort of a displacement of elements, so I can preview where the item's going to land. And that can be done with multiple items too. So that seems to be working pretty well. Incidentally, one other thing now that we're on the list view that I'd like to just highlight is that it is now possible when right-clicking over an element in the list view to see the options menu. That is something that is going to be, I think, really useful. Cool. So this PR is pretty close. It would obviously, I mean, if any folks have ideas about this or they have feedback, feedback is always very welcome on the pull request. Any testing, try and figure out if you can break it in any way, that is also very welcome. And there's another pull request I want to show, which is kind of more of a new feature. This is one of mine, and it is trying to create the ability to create layouts with drag and drop. And so the idea is that you have a bunch of blocks and you want to sort of create side-by-side layouts. So say with two images, if you drag one image up next to another, that will actually transform the two images into a gallery block. And if you have two different types of blocks, say paragraph and an image, you drag the paragraph next to the image and it'll create a row with both the blocks in them. So this is like pretty sort of experimental feature. It's been something that's been talked about for quite a while. It's just we're finally getting around to trying to implement it. So this pull request is also open for feedback and testing and all of that. If you'd like to give feedback on it, I can share the links in the chat. Where's my Zoom window? Here. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it from me. I can stop sharing now. Can I stop sharing?
Yeah, thanks for going through those.
How do I stop sharing?
There should be a button towards the bottom, but
oh no, that's not it. Oh my god, yes, I see
like,
it.
I could probably override
I
you.
never use Zoom. Can you tell that I never use Zoom?
One of the
I'll
lucky
share those
few.
PRs on that.
Yeah, and I'll make sure in the notes that we have everything linked up to what we showed. We have a lot of awesome questions and dialogue. I'm gonna quickly recap some of it, and then we can jump into some of these. I think some of these would be great to have recorded and talked through live. Jordan, I'm going to start with your question first, around basically permissions and capability checks. So do pattern overrides include capability checks so that it's possible for someone to be able to use the pattern and the overrides without editing the pattern as a whole? And you rephrase it later on, where it's like, what I'm thinking of is having a meta capability for managing the pattern and then a separate capability for doing overrides. So you'd be able to theoretically make it possible for some users to edit the overrides, and I'm guessing some not to. So I tried to dig into this and ping some folks, and I don't think we have an answer just yet, but I think this is a great thing to open into a GitHub issue. If you would like to do the honors, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, as part of recapping this conversation, I'll open up a GitHub issue for discussion. So
yeah, and
out there.
I think the current state of this is by default, anyone in WordPress is able to create a pattern because any capability has the UI to create a new one. So anyone technically also can manage all the patterns from others. I think you could technically override the pattern meta capabilities. But as far as I'm aware, for the actual synced patterns and the overrides feature, there is no additional meta capability, and it's just every user is able to use all the overrides.
Yeah, so the issue would be around adding the capability, basically. Yeah, thanks for recapping that. That is perfect.
I would plus one that that's an important thing to add because it's synced overrides. It's not just important from like an efficiency standpoint, but also important to enforce constraints, particularly within like larger sites, like enterprise sites, for example, where you don't want the marketing team touching the structure and design of a pattern, but you do want them modifying the content. So putting in those guardrails. So I agree, it's really important to consider.
Agreed. Related also to pattern overrides, Fabian started a conversation around how basically there's been a history of, I'll use like what's a good example? Probably block hooks that got released in 6.4 that I know some folks were wanting more functionality. There's some iterations in the works, but it's kind of like, do we release something early and get feedback, or do we wait till it's further more matured? How are we defining and keeping the bar at the right level for a minimum viable product? And so a conversation was had around that, particularly with pattern overrides, since it's right now just in the paragraph block. I jumped in and clarified that they're right now working to expand to headings, buttons, and images, but this is also, we're getting more feedback about the sorts of things you all would like to see would be helpful. And a question was raised around why it's limited to specific blocks, and it has to do with the block bindings API. And so that work is being done in Tangent. That API is being worked on partially with the pattern overrides work in mind, and so they can only be added. The override capability can only be added on a block by block basis right now. But I think the larger discussion, and I'd love to leave some space right now for around if folks would like talking about, you know, when to ship something, when to not. I err on the side of aiming to get what we can in and iterating, but I also agree there needs to be a certain threshold, of course. But I wanted to, that I feel like brought up a lot of lively discussion, so I wanted to leave some space for that here, if anyone wants to chime in.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance to find because you want to learn quickly, you want to iterate quickly, but you also want, even just from a marketing perspective, you want to make a splash as well during a release. So in this case, I think for pattern overrides, if we have the paragraph block, the heading, button, and image, that covers a lot of valuable use cases that I think would be interesting to get feedback on. And then kind of extend from there. There's probably some other limitations, like capabilities as an example, where that can come later, but that itself could be a blocker for people to adopt. But if we had those 4 blocks in, I would lean towards shipping it. Even if it isn't, I mean, it's not like it's something which we're forcing on people. It's kind of something that you kind of almost need to opt in by creating a synced pattern in a way. So in this case, I'd probably lean towards shipping earlier, getting feedback, and then extending what block types can be overridden and how. But yeah, it is a good question, not just for this, but any sort of feature like block connections as well. For example, you could argue that there's limitations even within the site editor that make this less useful until that's more evolved. But again, you could start getting feedback, and then just architecturally, it's important for sync patterns work.
I know a lot of it too is we definitely need the feedback. Like if we go way too far and then we don't get feedback, that's also an issue. So getting that balance right, I feel like is going to be a forever dance for every single release, at least in my experience with these things.
Yeah, I think it's a good call out that, as you mentioned, this is not forced on anyone. This is not a crucial feature. You could just not use this. But with one of the reasons why I was a little concerned about this particular feature is even with adding it to the button block right now, we're starting to uncover some of the limitations that we have with content only locking, where just the inspector area, for example, is not something that you can access at all. So even for the button, you would, with the overrides, you would not be able to set the rel attribute for the link, for example, because that is not accessible in the popover. And there are a bunch of those types of things where I think we will very quickly run into a lot of those issues with the content only mode. So my fear right now is that the actual underlying piece of kind of fundamental UI piece that we're using for this feature will need some work, which I know has been brought up in various comments there. And I think that may cause us more or a larger refactor of the feature going forward, which is making me a little more hesitant of rolling this out with this limited feature scope. But I'm not sure if that actually is a blocker. And I think releasing the update to include the heading and button block and then maybe also the image block may uncover some of those so that we can make more informed decisions in the beta period.
Yeah, which, spoiler alert, there's a early opportunities to help test posts where this exact kind of feedback, and Fabian, you've already beautifully jumped in. I'll add these in leaving feedback, which is really helpful. But this is exactly why we're having this call and getting this feedback out now, and trying to get folks to help test. I love a beta period testing, but I am a very proactive person, and I'd rather we kind of have a sense of what's known so we can make the best decisions possible, and help the squad out.
Probably what else would be useful is just for the community as a whole is listing out use cases for this. Like obviously we all have our own, come across our own scenarios, but having a list of how we might make use of pattern overrides will kind of give us an indication of, well, are we solving 80% of those for the first release, or are we actually not solving much of it at all? And then also, hopefully uncover some of those little edge cases, not edge cases, but little corners of the UI, like failure and the limitations of content only blocking, for example. So perhaps just add to the issue, to the block, to the overrides issue, we can start to put together a list of use cases. And from a marketing perspective, that's also useful as well.
All right, I will, unless someone wants to jump in, there's more discussion I wanted to recap. Okay, we covered those. Fabian, you asked about the overview, issues for block connections, and I will include this in the notes, but I did just want to open up these and show them real quick, so folks know they're in the right place if they're watching this back. So there's this custom fields and blocks, which I think is excellent just to read through to begin with. Like there's a lot of wonderful information in GitHub that gets summarized in different places, but this is definitely the meat of it. And then from there, this tracking issue, and specifically with this comment of like what's being looked at for an initial version for 6.5, is worth digging into more. And I'll quickly play this, which I'm pretty sure is the prototype. If I remember correctly, they've broken down the prototype into various smaller PRs to try and make it a bit easier to iterate and have discussions about the experience. But this is what's being looked at now. And this is definitely where I will not go through all of this, but you'll see part of, I think, what you'll find with this release is that there's a couple different APIs that are in progress, between the interactivity API going public, custom fields, block bindings, that's kind of powering other features, and we're gonna have to see where they land. And I think the good news is like stuff like block bindings is powering pattern overrides, but block bindings itself may not be quite there, but it can do what it needs to do for other features in the release, and then we can kind of iterate and see where the limitations are. So that's something to keep in mind with this when looking at these, and you can see this kind of sentiment if we can start small and implement new functionalities progressively. Let me then continue being able, so Felix brought this up, being able to edit meta fields as part of the regular content editing experience sounds super useful to me. I think the scope concern is certainly relevant in some contexts. However, for example, when you edit a single post, if you edit a meta field that also affects only that post, I'd argue there's no concern about confusing UX. In my opinion, the user wouldn't even have to know that this piece of data is technically meta. And then this led to a lovely larger conversation. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about this on the call.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm curious if the initial scope. I haven't read through this issue yet. Just seeing it, but seems to be the initial scope was to connect to existing meta that is already being stored from somewhere else. I guess, and there are historically many ways to do that. But I think having some kind of first citizen support in the block editor for maybe even connecting. I don't know if is it possible to connect to a field for which there's no value set yet. Like that's maybe where my question comes from. Like if I don't know, if a plugin defines some meta field somewhere and the end user hasn't set a value for it yet, would it still be possible to connect that field to a block?
I don't know
And
if
this
someone
way,
else
it
can
would basically allow editing.
Yeah, one of
I've got a in my sort of plugin, one of my plugins that I've been working on. We've got recruiter profiles, and we want to be able to use the UI, Gutenberg block UI, to allow people to go and edit their profiles, and we need to store that data in the post meta so that we can use it elsewhere. And that's the sort of classic opportunity where I think it will be really nice. At the moment, we're like hooking in API calls and doing loads of sort of back end work, whereas if it could be native into the system, and I said sort of talked about a sort of a save mode, and what I'm imagining in there is that the ability for this content to be updatable. It's like a switch. It can be part of the template, part of the config. That you could allow that this set of post meta is updatable, and or it is read once, and if you edit it, it's disconnected. Like a mode that we can assign to maybe individual metas. Yeah, just a thought. Yeah.
Yeah, and Felix, to the actual question of the what happens when a value doesn't exist for something, whenever we build custom meta blocks for projects, one of the limitations that we quickly run into is when something is a block level element, like I'm using the example of a price again, oftentimes you do want to display a label in front of that price because any of the connections are not actually inline just inside of the text as just tokens in that text, but they are actually just block level elements. So it happens because you don't have conditional rendering logic for only render of this label if this value only exists, that you have orphaned labels, that you have the price label without an actual price displaying if the value doesn't exist. So as far as the actual implementation for the connection right now works is if the meta value does not exist, that block, of course, doesn't render, but that doesn't mean that any adjacent blocks that you may use as a label or that kind of reference that also don't also render because, yeah, again, there is no conditional.
Can these, yeah, that makes sense. Can these connections be defined in like, is it defined in the block, in the actual, could it be defined by a theme, like a theme template, or is it only stored in the database somehow? Like because I think that would be really, I don't know if that's already the case, but it would be really cool to basically have a theme that supports a specific plugins post meta, and then the theme already makes these connections that the user can edit them.
Yeah, I think ideally that would be the case, particularly if you think about WordPress, the idea of blueprints and being able to share configurations of WordPress around that may contain content types, like an event type or a project type, then you want to be able to include block connections with that as well. And in a way, if we do enable write or editing capabilities with block connections, you're kind of creating a form. And when you edit a form, values can be empty, or you can provide default values, which would be the same for this. Perhaps when you define a field, you can say that it's a default value, but even if it's empty, we should still show the block because it is a way of, it's an input method. the same way as a text field isn't implemented in a form. So it's that sort of meant the form mental model for this is really interesting to think about, because it's just like a nicely presented form in a way.
Yeah, big plus one that I think I would love to see that, where even if there's no value, the field would be displayed either there's a default value defined on the meta field, but alternatively maybe even the connection could somehow say like, if there is no value, display this instead, or something like that, like where there's some alternative so that the user can still enter a new value for something that's not there.
And just
placeholder state.
yeah, that also just sharing that from the agency perspective, that essentially is what we're doing in many projects right now. We're defining custom blocks for the meta connections. Those custom blocks are template locked into the single post template, for example, and then you can actually edit all of those values right in line. As an end user, you don't really see that. The only thing that doesn't quite match with what we have in the block connections right now is that oftentimes, because those are custom blocks, we need to include the label for those fields in that block, because we don't want to render the label if the value isn't defined, which is a limitation that I honestly, thinking through this issue, very much have not come up with a good solution for how we hide an adjacent block if the value of that meta field isn't populated. But somehow, kind of maybe at some point, I think in the custom fields issue that was created, it also mentions rich text formats as a future, that you could have an inline token that is a meta field, and maybe that solves some of these things, but sure.
Yeah, this is great. I'm gonna recap this, and one of the things I love about these hallway hangouts is then we can pass it on to the folks working on this to kind of watch this discussion and follow up too. So I had kind of time stamped when this conversation happened. I do want to be careful that we're coming up on an hour, and I don't want to go longer than an hour. I have a flight to catch in a bit. I'm curious if there's any final questions, or was this helpful as like an early look? Anything like that. Cool.
I was really excited to hear about the section styling stuff that you're working on that is being demoed. One of the things that I heard, if I understood correctly, is that part of supporting that feature was the idea of registering a set of like block variations that are not block specific. I know we're doing a lot of work right now in this release cycle to do an iteration of how like block variations are currently registered, because the variations themselves can be very expensive from a performance standpoint to generate, and that data is really only needed in the editor context. It's not needed during the front end, because what happens is when you edit, you choose your variation, and that applies the settings to the block or the set of blocks, that sort of thing. So I was just curious to know a little bit more about kind of how if my understanding was correct, and how you're kind of thinking about making those variations visible to the editor, or if there's someplace I can go.
Like right now, from what I'll summarize, but right now section specific styling is like, let's call it like an umbrella piece of work. For 6.5, what's being looked at is what I think we might, I don't know, the naming is up in the air, but colorways is some of what Saxon was talking through. And I don't know, Saxon, if you have like a better, I actually bet I could pull up a quick.
Yeah, it goes beyond colorways at this point, because you can style more than just colors within it. It's essentially block style variations implementation. But the users, from users' perspective, yes, we do want to allow the creation of block style variations outside of a singular block, so it can apply to multiple block types. I'm not the right person to answer the technical, like the performance questions around that, though. I know there's been some challenges around CSS nesting and making sure that it's actually a lot deeper than what it sounds on the surface, a lot more technical.
Are you looking at, with 6.5, trying to make the authoring of these sorts of variations like a user feature, or is this like a theme specific feature?
Just through code.
Or
Yeah,
what's
for
that?
V1, for V1 it'll just be through code. There are two
Okay.
ways of doing it in current branch. You can register it like in a PHP function. It's a registered block style variation, and then you can
Yep.
you can put in the whatever blocks you want to support that variation. And then there's also some work being done to support it in theme.json as well.
Okay.
But yeah, in future, maybe surfacing it in the UI, like in global styles UI as well. But that will be down the road.
Okay.
This would be awesome, again, as like Saxon mentioned earlier, to get feedback on and use cases on and limitations like Fabian's been diving into, like all that sort of stuff at this stage is super helpful. So yeah, definitely check this stuff out.
If I can say something,
Please.
I just shared in the chat the pull request where the work on extending block style variations is taking place. And one of the critical issues we're encountering now is around CSS specificity. And one of the things I would like to try to do would be to further reduce the specificity of global styles. So global styles that we can declare in theme.json for blocks, because currently they have a specificity of the block class name. I don't know how much that might break, like reducing that specificity to say 0 might break things for themes. I have a draft PR in progress to try and figure out how that could work that I can also share here. And it would be great. I think that this really needs feedback, and especially from theme developers. I'm not 100% sure how to best get this, like get
I got
the
you.
most awareness possible around this, because this could potentially, well, I mean, it's definitely a breaking change. The question is how breaking it is, how much will it break? But I think that ultimately reducing the lower the specificity of core styles are, the better chances we have of being able to continue to build more features on top of them sustainably.
Yeah, and just because I see you're typing the comments to the block themers, I think this actually may be a good thing to call out in that early testing blog post, just as a note, as an annotation, because I think the main people that are going to be impacted by this are developers of classic themes, because they are fighting with the specificity of core more than block themes. They usually are a little more aligned with the current thing, and yeah, I think the classic themes are the main ones that would need to test some of this.
Which also ties into another thing that I'll note for anyone watching this. Isabel, this also impacts the work you've done. Support for appearance tools in classic themes is also ready to go and has been completed. So that's another thing that I purposely didn't call out in this call for testing, but I'm you kind of beat me to what I've been trying to think of is how to pull out these more less like UX feedback, but more we need like technical feedback. So yeah, that's a great one. I think I'm gonna add a new section to that post and add in this as well as this so we can get more feedback there. And I think that that is actually a great place to end on, which is please help test. So thank you for the full circle moment. And I will edit this post to get those two things in place because those are definitely things we need feedback on, and maybe even pull in some of the section specific styling stuff. Like we can kind of flesh this out more. We haven't often done this early of a post, so I think we should play around with this format. But thank you so much to everyone who joined. Thank you to Saxon and Isabel for demoing and for chatting. Thanks for all the great questions, and just keep it coming. I think there's a lot of exciting stuff to look forward to at 6.5, but we also need to make sure we get it there. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great day if you're starting it or the rest of it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah.